President of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, and this is World Review, our weekly review of the world's news. And boy, have we had a lot of news. Here to talk about all of it is Matt Kaminski, who is editor-in-chief of POLITICO. Matt, great to have you.
Good to see you.
And Susan Glasser, staff writer of The New Yorker. Susan, wonderful to have you come with us back again. And from Hong Kong, Prashant Rao, who's in quarantine because the Hong Kong government wants foreign visitors to make sure that they don't have COVID. Prashant Rao is the international editor of The Atlantic. Prashant, wonderful to have you as well.
Having me. Well,
let's start with the big news overnight. The president's testing positive and the First Lady testing positive for COVID. We are seeing reports of the fact that the president is symptomatic, that he's having symptoms. Matt, what does this mean for the wider issues that we are facing domestically, but also importantly in terms of foreign policy?
Well, I guess this is the October surprise, but I also want to add a caveat that we're only on October 2nd, so we still have a long time to go, and you never know. I mean, look, for Donald Trump, this is terrible news for his campaign, potentially for his health and well-being. But let's just look at the politics. You know, he's someone who really depends on looking strong. You know, a lot of his public image is, I don't need a mask. This is not a big deal. He's repeatedly kind of sent the message that Corona is you know, doesn't affect most people. And he's really tried to make the campaign not about the coronavirus because that is his biggest vulnerability politically. And this obviously makes coronavirus not only the main topic of conversation for weeks to come, it also means that he won't be able to go out there on the trail and really would seem to undermine him. I think the other caveat we want to add here is that there is a history with Donald Trump of saying, sort of writing him off. You know, the Access Hollywood tape 4 years ago around this time, the information, the sort of news of Russian meddling in our elections, and he got through that. So there are scenarios, if you look at Bolsonaro in Brazil, who also had COVID, was also a COVID denialist and came out of it actually stronger. This is a very different context, and it is a very, very big deal.
Susan, what's your first reaction to this when you heard about it late last night? How do you look at the implications of this for Donald Trump, the elections, and of course our standing in the world?
Yeah, I do think it's another terrible blow to U.S. standing in the world. There's no question that it will already reinforces what the rest of the world is thinking, which is what kind of a superpower has the worst performance on a public health crisis, essentially of any leading country in the world, with more than 200,000 dead and a president who has denied his own government's efforts to handle the situation. You have, I think, really a sense that the America that existed doesn't exist anymore, and that its claims to leadership, already frayed, perhaps, you know, are potentially unrecoverable in the sense that it's a colossal failure, not just of the president, but of the millions of people who have chosen to follow him into this folly of denialism. And, you know, I think that it would be one thing if he had collapsed in the polls earlier in this, but the fact that both the public health crisis is escalating into a fall second wave, which does appear to be occurring, and the economic crisis appears to be escalating because of, once again, the complete failure of our political class to do anything about it. Just yesterday, in fact, the latest rounds of talks on a coronavirus relief package appeared to be going nowhere because Republicans have refused to proceed. And the bottom line is, we're looking at a situation, the problem is, this is a situation where we need to be really, really outraged, and it's really hard to do that and to summon that at all times. But just to level set, the United States government, because of Donald Trump, has failed to pass any relief for its citizens in an economic crisis since this spring. 200,000 people are dead. 2 days ago, the president was mocking his opponent for wearing masks. And just last night, hours before admitting finally after reporters reported about coronavirus in the White House, just last night, the president gave a taped address to the Al Smith dinner in New York City, in which he said that the pandemic is going away and it's just finally disappearing. So again, these facts are known, but I think it's important to start and begin conversations with them, because the implications for U.S. leadership in the world cannot be overstated. I've thought since the beginning of the Trump presidency that, he was the biggest geopolitical risk and geopolitical story in the world. And I think this diagnosis suggests exactly why.
Prashant, you're in Hong Kong. You have the advantage of being up all day while the news has been streaming into Asia, and I'm sure you've been pulsing what's going on in the world. What's the reaction where you are and that you're seeing in your hometown in London to this news?
I think a lot of it is, hitting on some of the things that Susan said. This idea of American weakness and American frailty is really quite striking. I think you see this in the rhetoric. I wouldn't go so far as to say people are being triumphalist, but you can see this in how RT is sort of marketing this in kind of a really tongue-in-cheek fashion. The editor-in-chief of the Global Times, who's not obviously representative of the Communist Party, but the Global Times is a mouthpiece for the CCP to some extent, has also talked about how this speaks to America not taking this seriously, and the presidency not taking this seriously. And you look by contrast here, Hong Kong is a slightly different example, but on the mainland we see in Wuhan and other parts of mainland China, life is not back to normal, but it is certainly by leaps and bounds better than where Wuhan was, in February and March. And the caseload in Hong Kong's authorities send out a daily email outlining how many new cases are in the city on a day-to-day basis. And a couple days ago, one of my colleagues here sent me the latest email, and it was 4 people. And it's just so striking, especially and compared to London as well. And as journalists, I think we often try to crystallize all of these kind of pulsating trends into a sort of perfect moment that symbolizes all of these things. And it's hard not to do that in this moment, where you have the leader of a country that has progressively and consistently denied what is happening, who has, made it difficult to push forward with any of these kind of coronavirus mitigation efforts, leaving aside a vaccine. And then he gets the coronavirus. It's really hard not to take this as a moment where we have to evaluate where the United States stands in the world. And its power was always based in its competence, and it's in the fact that it was a place where people wanted to move to and go to. And the more we think about this, the more, in fact, it becomes clear that it's certainly not where it was, from an intangible as well as a tangible point of view.
Matt, take this a little larger and let's widen the lens, because this is also the week in which the millionth death has been recorded for coronavirus. We're seeing really big spikes through key parts of Europe, including, of course, Spain and France. Now numbers are starting to rise, even in Italy, in Great Britain. We are, our baseline is 40,000, not more than that, which is twice as high as it was in the summer. I mean, this thing is exploding for us. But then if you look at other parts, including where Prashant is in East Asia, it seems to be under control there in a different way. So how should we look at this in a more global perspective?
Well, I think the remarkable thing is that because Trump has taken the political position that he has taken, he's actually in some ways sort of undersold some of the, I wouldn't call it a success, but some of the challenges that have been, met and in some ways overcome. Yes, we've had delays on the recovery bill, but, the Congress did come together. We had a pretty good response economically to kind of really sort of soften the blow relative to other Western countries. Yes, there is a degree of surprise about American incompetence, but in per capita terms, in terms of fatalities, and even in terms of sort of infections, the U.S. is not an outlier compared to the UK, Italy, or France. And we are dealing with a virus that we could no longer contain and we can mitigate. There's certainly, examples of countries that have done better, but this is a virus which is just spread very quickly around what happens to be a very big country, the US, where you can't close borders and you have 300 plus people, where in Europe they were able to contain it because the Belgians could close the border with Sir Germany. The fact that you're seeing it come back in Europe the way it has in the fall suggests that this is, until we get a vaccine or the virus, to quote Trump or paraphrase Trump, kind of flames itself out, it is very hard for public policymakers to really control. So I think that's a little bit of perspective that's sort of worth keeping in mind. And also, I guess I know that, the Russia Today and the Global Times are going to take pot shots at the US. I would not hold Russia up as an example of sort of positive of anything these days. And China is dealing with its own challenges. Yes, it helps to be a totalitarian nation when you can kind of lock down people to prevent the spread. But I think, China arguably will emerge out of this weaker, at least diplomatically, if not economically. So I think sort of maybe it's a bit premature to write off the US as a global power because of the noise that we are able to generate by Twitter and among our political class around this.
Well, Matt, I think that's a little bit unfair to say that it's about Twitter when there are 200,000 dead Americans and the President of the United States has brought in garbage science and told Americans to disregard what public health authorities have to say, undermined the credibility of the vaccine that we hope and pray will exist but does not yet exist, so that many people might not even take it, literally taken a government that was not, oh, we might be as good as Italy, but taking a government that was ranked #1 in the world for public health preparedness and said, we're not going to be #1 anymore. We're going to suck. And we're going to have a president of the United States who's going to lie to the public and be, by the way, an agent of Russian disinformation. So just yesterday, we've forgotten about it because, in fact, we are now wondering what happens when the most powerful man in the world is stricken with a potentially lethal illness in the highest risk group 32 days before an election. And so we've forgotten that his former national security advisor was on television yesterday saying that the president of the United States is aiding and abetting Russian disinformation. So I'm sorry, but I don't see that as something that you can excuse. I mean, I have to say, I know that we all like to be very reasoned and, that's part of the scam here that we've been subjected to for 5 years is that there's, well, he's not so bad and hey, it worked out okay. Thank God America has great doctors and public health professionals and civil servants who are doing their jobs under these conditions. But I'm sorry, that's not a good story to tell for Donald Trump and the Republicans. And anyone who thinks it is I mean, it's just, this is shocking. This is how it works. And anyone who had the experience that you've had, covering and understanding what happens in societies that are not free. We have been subjected to a withering barrage of lies and disinformation that has had a deadly cost. Can I say exactly how many of those dead people wouldn't be dead? No, although people are trying to figure that out. But, look, come on.
So, I mean, Matt.
My only point is not about, just sort of briefly to, I think, just to address Susan's point. We do have an election in this country in a month, and this is not a Trump strength, clearly. I think I'm more trying to put in perspective sort of where America as a country and American institutions and trying to divorce that from the Trump phenomenon. And I think, in some ways the institutions have been tested, but have mostly passed the test. I guess we'll see in a month, but the country will have a say on their president, and a lot of the views that you've just articulated are sort of shared widely in this country. So,
and I know that, Matt, and I do appreciate that, and I think we don't know yet what the full damage is to the United States, but as far as the success of our institutions, what we've seen is a total collapse of one of our two major political parties. But I take the point, and I agree, obviously, with a lot of what you're saying about, the greatness of a people is not measured in, the terribleness of one of them.
No, and I think Matt, it was worth putting the U.S. case within the perspective of the overall picture, because the overall picture I think it is decidedly mixed. There's some countries that have done extraordinarily well, in part because of reasons that their systems allow them to do that, and others who have, even on a relative and an absolute basis, done absolutely terribly, including one country, Prashant, where you live, where the leader of that country was also struck early on. Boris Johnson had to go to hospital, was on a ventilator, got pretty darn close to not making it, and yet even today doesn't seem to have a coherent strategy for dealing with this issue. It's a tough set of issues.
Yeah, I think in a lot of ways, Britain is, I don't know if it's a more troubling example than the United States, but Britain had some interesting failures that are, I think it's very easy from afar to attribute it to Johnson's struggles, that Johnson did the wrong thing. But in fact, I think it goes much deeper than that. And that speaks to some genuine systemic problems in the United Kingdom. Because, I think my impression is that outside of the UK, there's a very kind of comparison that's made that Johnson is Britain's Trump, and he's kind of a sort of parallel figure in a lot of ways. And I think that's not really quite right. Johnson followed the science. He never denied that the coronavirus was, he actually was at pains to be, alongside his scientific advisors, his medical advisors. He, certainly had some early sort of mistakes in the process, but, a lot of things failed in Britain, in fact, not just prime ministerial leadership. And I mean, I think this perhaps speaks to, I wouldn't claim to be as familiar with the United States case, but I think the British example is troubling from a longer term point of view, because it speaks to how, the prized National Health Service, which is really at the core of British political life in so many ways, it met the kind of short-term core crisis in the spring, and yet tens of thousands of people still died because enormous mistakes were made along the way. And it really illustrated the fragility of a lot of the systems in Britain. And I think now we're seeing is, again, a real difficulty in convincing people, one, to trust the government. And I think once that trust has been eroded, it's just so difficult to build it back up. I mean, I'm not breaking any news by saying that, but, I think the difficulty in Britain now is you just consistently see everything that the government does is really hard to interpret as having a fulsome strategy behind it. It's really, hard to take on, particularly, there's a controversy a few months ago with the Prime Minister's chief advisor kind of leaving London and going to his own kind of home, and plays into a number of political issues. Britain is, it's hard to I don't want to overblow it, but Britain is certainly struggling beyond what it should be. Susan made the point that the United States was ranked #1 in terms of pandemic preparedness. Britain was #2, and was very proud of that ranking. I mean, either we should reinterpret how those rankings were calculated, or those countries really did something bizarre to have deserved them.
I think New Zealand was ranked number 53, so did pretty well. But helps to be an island, although Britain is too. In that case, listen, we can continue this conversation on COVID for a long time, and we will. But let me switch for a moment, because another big story this day, in a slightly different way, Susan, is the publication of the book that you and Peter Baker, your husband, have written on Jim Baker. And Jim Baker, we can talk a lot about Jim Baker and his role and what it means for the current situation. But let's take one particular point in his storied career that you and Peter write about, which is the assassination of Ronald Reagan in a few months into his presidency. And Baker, then chief of staff, quite distrusted by many Reaganouts who didn't think he was particularly conservative enough, using that moment in some way to put his stamp on the administration, but also understanding the nature of crisis. And this is different. Donald Trump is able to fulfill the duties of the presidency in a way that Ronald Reagan wasn't so much. But what can we learn from this moment, and how does that change? How did it change in the 1980s, and what might it mean for today?
Well, thank you, Ivo. I understand that at this moment it's only big news to us, but it is interesting. and I think Peter and I found this in working on the book too, to try to go back and think about, a time when Washington worked in a different way than it does right now, because, Prashant has just, I think, gotten to the essence of the problem right now, which is it's not just about one person, whether it's, Boris Johnson or Donald Trump, but the broader crisis of faith in Western institutions and in democracy right now clearly makes some countries, including the United States and perhaps Britain, uniquely vulnerable when something like this has come up. And crises clarify in governments. And so in the US, we do have a long history of, first of all, presidents being struck with health problems. Unfortunately, we don't have a good record on that. And we have a long record, actually, of official misinformation and not telling the truth to the American people. So that's very worrisome in the sense that the record of history combined with the record of this administration suggests we may or may not get the full truth. And then you look at something like the 1981 assassination and attempt on Ronald Reagan's life. It came very early in the administration. Jim Baker, as you said, was sort of still viewed with suspicion. He was one of a very uneasy troika, that's what it was called, of power brokers in the White House. Hadn't really established a personal bond yet with the president. He had actually run George Bush's campaign against Ronald Reagan and Gerald Ford's. And yet, what do people crave in a crisis, whether it's right now or back then? Of course, the leadership, the appearance of stability, the sense that someone is in charge who knows what they're doing, the sense that the wheels are not coming off, and that the instability will be handled. And Baker seemed to have an intuitive sense of that. Of course, there's terrible misinformation even inside the bubble. He and others in the White House initially were told it wasn't, that serious, and then only figured out at the hospital, in fact, how close to death Ronald Reagan had become. And by the way, Baker's instinct, and I think we can expect this from this White House as well, absolutely was to minimize the nature of the crisis, was not to alarm people. They didn't want people to know that, how close Reagan was to death. In fact, they wanted to strictly limit visitors for that reason. They didn't want to invoke the 25th Amendment transitioning power. And there's a really fascinating story, in fact, where Vice President Bush was out of town at that time doing an event in Texas, I believe. And, he was immediately flown back to Washington. While he was en route, there was the famous Al Haig, "I'm in charge here" press conference, which blew up his career as much as Jim Baker found his career rising because he exuded a sort of calm competence, right? He was famous for his legal pads. He was taking notes. He was marshaling the forces of government. And one thing he did was someone brought him a memo that had been drafted that would constitute a transfer of power to Bush. And he and his aide literally grabbed this piece of paper, said, "Don't let anyone ever see it." One of his advisors put it in his safe to make sure that it didn't happen. They made this decision in a closet at George Washington University Hospital without consulting with anyone. So remember, a few takeaways from that are relevant to what we're going to be seeing over the next days and weeks. Number one, we don't really know what's going on, and there will be all sorts of intrigue and drama. And by the way, it might actually revolve around the question of internal debates in the administration about whether and when Trump might be forced to temporarily cede power under the 25th Amendment. And so that's one issue that we're likely not to know about for some time. What are the internal debates? Number two, what does the public see about the confidence in the government and how it's handling the crisis? Transparency, who's giving regular briefings? Are they putting Trump out in front of us to show us a picture that does or does not comport with the medical reality? And so those are the kinds of things that I think are very likely to come up now. And, careers will be both made and broken by this moment. As we were talking, Mark Meadows, the current White House Chief of Staff in that Jim Baker role, just before we began this program, came out on the White House lawn to brief reporters, but it was a very short exchange. I don't think it inspired I don't know if it was a Hagian moment, but it certainly wasn't a Baker moment. First of all, he came out without wearing a mask, which has been one of the things that has consistently been so disturbing from the White House. And the idea that even now with the president and the first lady, suffering from this illness, that he would still disregard public health advice in this way. So I think we're early moments in the crisis, but for me, it has been very useful to look at history and what it can tell us. And Baker, had some very direct experience with something like this.
Prashant, what do you think we should be looking for? What Baker-esque efforts, if Mark Meadows or anybody else, Mike Pompeo, has read, which they should, Susan's and Peter's book, or leaders, there may be other examples. This is both a danger and an opportunity for an administration to sort of make a mark and maybe change the story.
When I was reading more of Susan and Peter's book, I've also been reading, this is not a terribly sort of innovative choice of book for this time of year, but I've been reading It Can't Happen Here by Sinclair Lewis. And there's this great passage that made me think of, their descriptions of Baker, which goes, is it just possible that the most vigorous and boldest idealists have been the worst enemies of human progress instead of its greatest creators? Possible that plain men with the humble trait of minding their own business will rank higher in the heavenly hierarchy than all the plumed souls who have shoved their way in among the masses and insisted on saving them. I mean, Baker's greatest strength was his competence, right? The fact that he didn't really have this kind of visionary world that he wanted to create. He just wanted to retain power and then hang on to it and do it in a way that ensured that he kind of did the things he wanted to do. It's kind of striking how, I think the things that, would be hard to mark now, but we will only know in 2, 3, 4 weeks and time after, is who made competent decisions in this moment. Because, it was similar when, I think making the sort of Johnson-Trump comparison, again, as I said, is not the perfect one. But the interesting thing about what happened when Johnson went into hospital was there were real questions about who is in charge of decision-making, who can be trusted to make these decisions, and then who did Johnson delegate. There's politics, there's policy, and there's competence, and how those three things interact, I think, in this moment will become incredibly important, more so than other times, because there is no figurehead, and so there's no one to point to say this decision was made. And so I think the lesson of Baker is, in fact, in this moment that, policy, I would say, matters less. Competence and just getting through the day without making any enormous mistakes will be the order of the day. And I mean, unfortunately, this White House hasn't really shown that it's sort of, at least on the coronavirus, kind of willing to go with the science in a very kind of aggressive way. But that's what I would be watching for, that kind of question of competence, which is, I think, plagued this administration to some degree.
Matt, jump in here.
Actually, a question for Susan. I was sort of curious whether Jim Baker, let's say he'd be 30 years younger right now, where would he find himself in this town, in his party? Do you think he would adapt, or would he be at his nice law practice in Houston and you wouldn't be writing a book about him? So.
Matt, it's a great question. And obviously, Peter and I have sort of debated it among ourselves for years, actually, not, even just in the context of this present crisis. A lot of people were surprised, as were we actually, to see Baker wrestling with Trump in the way that he has. And he very reluctantly voted for him 4 years ago, has said at various points to us that he would consider voting for Biden, and then said, no, don't say that. Who knows where he'll end up. But I think the broader point is, he has moved with the modern Republican Party to a certain extent. It's kind of unthinkable that the Baker of 1989 or 1991 would not have spoken out more forcefully against Trump. But his view of power is one, I think, Prashant, you really nailed it in terms of a sort of complete confidence is at the heart of what Baker was able to bring to the White House, combined, I would say, with a sort of natural set of deal-making skills that happen to suit a moment in time that is unfortunately now really gone in American politics, when the incentives were to create deals and there were political rewards for for doing so, that the point of campaigning was actually then to be able to govern. And now, permanent campaigning is the end in and of itself. So I think we did come to believe, Matt, that, he was a man of his moment, as opposed to that not everything he did was translatable. For example, he may have taken the wrong lesson from his success at working with Ronald Reagan and managing him effectively. And he may have thought that, well, Trump could be managed. Many Republicans believed this. This sort of adults in the room theory, in fact, was that people like Jim Mattis or H.R. McMaster, Rex Tillerson could actually constrain, and that the president would be essentially uninterested in the details, and therefore they might be able to do the work. That was essentially what many people thought about Ronald Reagan, who at the time was seen as a sort of, above it all figure who was not very interested in the details, wanted to go up to the White House residence and have TV dinners with Nancy Reagan. So Baker, may have applied the lessons of his time to our very different time. But I think that you can't manage Donald Trump. You can't be a competent White House chief of staff in the way that Jim Baker was. And I do think that while he was not an ideologue, he did have a solid foundation, not only a set of personal and moral principles and character, but he had a solid view of America's place in the world, American leadership, and also instincts that were very different than today's Republican Party. For example, and then I'll stop, in 1981, when Ronald Reagan had the chance to make a Supreme Court appointment, it was Jim Baker who pushed him to nominate Sandra Day O'Connor to become the first woman on the Supreme Court. It's a very historic appointment. The conservatives of Reagan's day, the true believers, were furious about this, and they tried to stop Jim Baker. And in fact, Baker, using his power, just for competence, but he used his power to stop them from even having a meeting with Ronald Reagan to bring their grievances about O'Connor to the president directly. And of course, that went down as a major part of Reagan's legacy. And I think that's a clear-cut example where Baker did have principles that, had he had the power to apply them in today's Washington, it would be better than where we are.
The good news is for those who are members of the Chicago Council of Global Affairs, Susan and Peter are coming back in a couple of weeks to have a conversation about the book. And many of the comparisons, there's so much more that we can talk about Jim Baker that is relevant to today. And just switching over, one of the big crises that he faced as Secretary of State, of course, was Tiananmen Square and the crisis in China. 30 years forward, Prashant, we have a very different China. And a very different leader. And this week we found new reports out of an Australian think tank about continued efforts to discriminate against and worse, much worse, of Uyghurs in Xinjiang province, as well as Xi Jinping talking about it. What do we find out, Prashant, and how should we start thinking about this?
I mean, you're right to highlight the work that the Australian Strategic Policy Institute has done. I think some of the best analysis and actually new information about China coming out has been coming from places like ASPI and the Jamestown Foundation, which has done some really fantastic work. Adrian Zenz there has done some great work on both Xinjiang and Tibet recently. But the sort of latest revelations are about using satellite imagery to illustrate both the increase in construction in apparent detention facilities and the case of the destruction of mosques and other religious facilities.
We seem to have frozen in Hong Kong. So, Matt, take or there you are. You're back again. Prashant, you're frozen for a minute in Hong Kong.
Sorry about that.
Been because about Xinjiang. Who knows?
Maybe, I don't know. But no, I think, like I was just saying, those two research institutes have been fantastic on this, and other researchers as well, I would say, ASPI and Jamestown. But, I think there are a couple of things that we can take away from this. One, I think it's important to note that a lot of the reporting that news organizations have had to do about this have had to be done remotely. Reporters like, the New York Times' Chris Buckley, or, reporters for the Wall Street Journal and the Washington Post have all had to do this from outside of China, because they were effectively thrown out, the vast majority of American journalists. And then, we know about these ABC journalists and Australian journalists who've also been thrown out, and there's an Australian national who's arrested, who works for Chinese state media. But I think the principal question that we're grappling with, at least in our newsroom, and to plug a piece I'm hoping we'll publish it tomorrow, but we're trying to grapple with this question of what happens to a culture when you basically strip it of all of its various component parts, when you sort of throw all of its people into a diaspora and sort of remove the prospect of them having a homeland. What happens when you ban them from speaking their native language, from practicing their faith? Is it possible to preserve that faith, to preserve that culture without a homeland? And I think this is a question we're going to have to grapple with more and more, because it's becoming abundantly clear that, whatever is happening in Xinjiang, being a Uyghur there now is no longer, you're no longer able to avail of the things that make you a Uyghur. And so, I think we have to start thinking about what does that mean for, a really kind of important culture that more than 10 million people are in some way linked to.
Matt, we used to call that ethnic cleansing not that long ago, and I think it's probably the right term to use in this particular case with regard to the Uyghurs. What I'm interested in, on the one hand, this is an issue that seems to grapple both sides of the aisle on Capitol Hill. And yet, on the other hand, it is not a dominant part of either the executive branch or, quite frankly, the Democratic candidate who will talk about it, and of course. But this is something that's been going on for a long time, and it doesn't seem to penetrate American politics in the same way that some other issues, whether it was Bosnia in the 1990s or so many other issues, did in the past.
Well, Ivo, you sort of missed that extended discussion of foreign affairs in Tuesday's debate between Biden and Trump.
So
you're used to the sort of phrase ethnic cleansing, obviously, that kind of came back into and was sort of most widely used in the 90s, I think, when at least Susan and I kind of came of professional age. In that decade, I think I just remember how the Balkans, Rwanda, obviously the decade ended with the intervention in kind of Kosovo, and that was kind of like a defining theme of global politics, the Western world standing up for sort of values. And where is the outrage? Frankly, in this town, maybe there's a congressman or two who might say something, but no one really talks about it. No one really cares, and no one's doing anything about it. And I think this is maybe where the blame can be widely shared. The Europeans are weak on China, and they're weak in general, and very kind of inward looking. In our country, for the left, the Bush presidency sort of poisoned that. Democracy promotion became kind of neoconservatism, became war. For the right, Obama's policy on sort of Syria, we had 500,000 Syrians have been killed, and easy call it a genocide. Samantha Power, who wrote a damn book about this, was the ambassador at the UN, didn't do anything about it. The red line was completely erased. So we're at a point now where we have no moral standing, and in fact, we actually don't even, frankly, talk about it or care.
Susan, I take that a step further. Of course, Bosnia was one of those issues that Secretary of State Jim Baker also didn't care about. And it's one of those issues that the Bush administration ignored to leave to its successor. It may be that this issue gets left to Donald Trump's successor. And yet, what are we going to do about it? How should we think about this issue? It's a big one.
No, I think Matt is right that, there's sort of been in both parties for very different reasons in Washington. It's become progressively harder, if not impossible, to have a meaningful conversation about human rights outside the United States, and also what is the role, if any, of democracy promotion at a time when our own democracy has been called into question. And so that has been a major shift for sure that comes with the wobbling of the lone superpower. However, I do think, and I recently wrote a piece for the New Yorker that was short, but about what a Biden foreign policy might look like or ought to look like in its beginning stages. And I definitely could be wrong here, but I think the opening exists, and I would not be surprised if you do hear a lot more from a President Biden were he to be elected about human rights, in part because of this horrible situation that is playing out with the Uyghurs. There is a turn in both parties as well to much more harsh view of China, a sense that the previous broad strategy of strategic engagement, of incorporating China into the world's institutions has failed, and that what comes next across the political spectrum in the US, there's more appetite for confrontation. Trump, of course, is so famously, amoral and realpolitik in his views of other countries. If anything, he seems to admire dictators rather than seek to find ways to confront them and to compare their systems with the American system. So I think, certainly the politics suggest that Biden has the opportunity to do so. Also, to the extent he played a big role in Obama foreign policy on the communication side, not so much, he often lost out internal fights, as you know, Ivo, in the Obama administration in terms of policy decisions, but he always had the instincts. He was the guy who was flying around to Russia's neighbors and reassuring them of U.S. support, and going to Georgia and Ukraine and places like that. So I do think that he's wired to bring back the idea of values in American foreign policy. It's a little bit harder for me to see, Matt, whether he'll be successful in creating actions to go along with that. And we do have the problem of American leadership more broadly that we talked about at the beginning of this with coronavirus, and what credibility does anyone have at this point? But maybe I'm being naive in saying that, and I'm definitely prepared to be proven wrong very quickly, but I see it as a possibility.
Prashant, last word to you. In London, of course, there's also been a hardening on the attitude with regard to Hong Kong, which is a particular issue very important to London, but a hardening on the attitude towards China. Do you think there might be, if a Biden is willing to push, there might be a receptivity in London and other parts of Europe to say, yeah, we really need to sort of switch our policy on China and put this much more centrally as part of our policy, or is economics going to continue to triumph as it has for so long?
I mean, I think actually you could make the argument, and I'm fairly sympathetic to it, that the Trump administration has forced Britain to change its tack on China because it has been so single-minded in its push against Huawei that effectively it has forced a complete sort of switch in the British foreign policy apparatus, which was, not sort of pro-Huawei, but was thought that it could contain any of the risks that came from Huawei being in the telecoms infrastructure. And it effectively, the Trump administration and the threat of a future U.S. trade deal held over Britain played a fairly significant role. And so I think it feels like what's happening is a secular shift to become a China hawk. I mean, I think what the requisite sort of characteristics of being a China hawk in DC or London, 5 years ago would pretty much make you a dove right now. Everybody's a China hawk, it feels like. And though I'm not sure that a Biden administration would necessarily suddenly, force Britain or Europe to be tougher on China. Perhaps though, a Biden administration, I'm sort of speculating, but would be more sympathetic to a human rights driven sort of push against China, whereas the Trump administration has been largely on an economics and trade fueled push against China. But I don't think that would necessarily mean that, Biden would be better at convincing London to harden.
Well, that's all we have time for this week. Again, fantastic discussion. Prashant Rao from The Atlantic, Matt Kaminski, Politico, Susan Glasser of The New Yorker. Thanks all for joining us, and for all of you watching today. This was World Review. We'll be back next week with a new edition. In the meantime, have a fantastic day and a wonderful weekend. And again, thanks for joining us.